Hello and welcome to our webinar, Financial Aid for Non-Traditional Programs, Action Steps for Non-Standard Term Success. This webinar is brought to you by the Learning House. I know some of you are partner schools and familiar with us, but for those that are not, we are an online education services provider servicing not-for-profit colleges and universities. We have been around 11 years. We were founded by a University of Louisville professor, and we offer everything from online course management and development to faculty training and professional development to admissions and enrollment and marketing. We are pleased to introduce Phil Malinowski, the owner and president of Higher Ed Strategies, who has worked with the Learning House in the past, most often with Jim Dunn, our vice president of enrollment. He has more than 25 years of financial aid and enrollment management experience. He has worked with more than 100 institutions, including both traditional colleges and universities and for-profit career and vocational schools. And we are very happy to have him here to talk about this very important subject. Thank you, Phil.
Thank you, Wendy. And welcome to today's website on financial aid for non-traditional programs. Today we will be reviewing both the advantages and challenges associated with administering financial aid for non-traditional programs. And our primary focus will be on non-standard terms, non-standard credit hour terms, term-based programs. Why do you need to consider, or why should you be concerned with this? Really, non-traditional programs are flourishing, growing considerably across the nation, both in the for-profit and the not-for-profit sector, and we're finding that they really are critical to many institutions' competitive position. The for-profit market has, over the past decade, has really garnished an incredible amount of market share from the not-for-profits by introducing non-traditional academic programming. What are some of the advantages of this type of program, or these types of programs? One is that they allow for multiple starts per year, and we refer to that as the multiple starts per year advantage. What does it mean for students? It offers students greater enrollment flexibility for starting a program. They don't have to wait until a semester comes around to begin the program. They're able to move through their academic program, start and finish it at a much faster pace, so they're able to accelerate their academic progression. And depending upon how the payment periods are set up for the program, it can help the student with cash flow in terms of the disbursement of financial aid. What are some critical advantages for the institutions? We know that schools that offer multiple starts per year in this type of format have increases in their conversion rates from applications to enrollment starts. So they're able to, enroll more students based on those who are applying. We also know that many schools have increased revenue and improved cash flow because they're bringing in more students more frequently. And with the increased revenue and cash flow, it offers the institution with revenue reinvestment opportunities, meaning that as that money comes in, they're able to reinvest it in other parts of their institution. Today we're going to review what I refer to as the 11 action steps for success when you're going to go non-standard, or if you've already gone, how to maybe reframe some of what you're doing. So this slide outlines the topics that we will review today. Garnishing support. You certainly can do it, but you're going to need a little help from your executive leadership. Here are some recommendations for successfully presenting your case to leadership for additional support. First, we highly recommend that the institution consider establishing a standing committee that consists of probably someone in financial aid, bursar, registrar, and the academic side, and anyone else critical to the process. That committee should be focusing on, at a minimum, the following areas, and tying the requests for investment to outcomes of headcount, to meeting enrollment objectives, to meeting revenue objectives. And the areas that you want to focus on are obviously systems, both what kind of IT systems do you need to support your activities, as well as staffing. What kind of staff do you need, not only in the financial aid office, but other areas as well? And how will each of these departments support each other? In other words, what will the cross-functional support be? Because we know that successfully administering non-standard financial aid for non-standard programs really requires what I refer to as cross-functional support across the different academic and administrative units within an institution. Staffing. We believe that successful administration of financial aid and non-traditional programs really requires shared responsibility. We also know that it is really critical that there is enough staff, especially in the financial aid area, but that a school that is either going to be introducing non-traditional programs or will be growing enrollment in those programs really needs to look at staff needs in all the departments that are impacted by this. What is your staff-to-student ratio? Typically, we often find staff-to-student ratios of one staff person dedicated to 500 financial aid recipients. When we're talking about non-traditional programs, not uncommon to find a lower ratio of maybe 1 to 250 or 1 to 300. Typically, it does take more administrative time to administer financial aid for students in non-traditional programs. We also highly recommend that institutions have financial aid staff that are dedicated to these programs. In other words, they're not sharing responsibilities for, let's say, awarding financial aid for traditional undergrads as well. We believe that by having dedicated staff, you'll have a more efficient operation, and you'll also be developing in-house experts in this area. It does take a slightly different mindset. There are a whole host of different rules, and so really creating your own in-house experts is important to creating a compliant operation and also awarding financial aid on a timely basis so that the students receive their funds timely and schools also have positive cash flow. Getting your systems configured. Many schools, most systems are not designed out of the box to handle non-traditional financial aid. And so it's important for you to first understand what your system's limitations are, but as well as their capabilities. Most schools that are able to configure their systems to handle non-traditional programs seek the assistance of outside consultants to do so. You really need experts within those systems to make it work. Unfortunately, if you're introducing new programs, you may need to go old school initially. And while it may seem painful, it is important, and it can actually help you map out the process for any future system configurations. Also, when you're looking at your system configuration, consider all the areas that are going to be impacted. So what do the bills need to look like? How will the bills be generated? What kind of information needs to get to the bursar, get out of the bursar? The same with the registrar, and what if any academic departments may be impacted by this as well. We also recommend that as you're configuring your system, you develop parallel functions during these transition periods so that you've got backup of your work and you don't lose data, and that you keep adequate documentation of the work that you've completed. We also highly recommend that you develop some kind of internal system to review or second read the work, at least initially until you have confidence that you are doing it correctly. Important to have your own internal system of checks and balances. Setting up internal controls, step number 4, is really quite critical. Many schools do establish policies and procedures and put them on the shelf. only to refer to them maybe when an auditor or program reviewer comes in. But it is important, especially in non-traditional programs, to develop sound policies and procedures. Policies state what you do. The procedure is really the internal control because it outlines how you're going to do it or how you do it. We also recommend that schools establish internal audit or review processes to double check that the procedures are being followed. And those can be done, every year or every other year, but the idea that you have someone internally who's reviewing policies and procedures can be incredibly valuable in helping you maintain compliance. We also know that when you're establishing policies and procedures, it's an iterative process, but it's really important to gain input from all parties who will be involved in implementing those policies and procedures so that you get buy-in and so that they actually are sustainable. Common high-risk areas that we see as a result of program reviews and compliance audits, changes in enrollment levels, how many credits, if a student, let's say, changes from 6 to 3, what that means to eligibility, grade level changes, academic progression, meaning how does a school track when a student progresses from, let's say, a sophomore to a junior and then gains additional loan eligibility. Enrollment reporting, you'll want to make sure you double check your reporting periods for the SSCR and for the Student Loan Clearinghouse to make sure that you will capture any changes in enrollment. Return of funds calculation is often a high-risk area because schools sometimes do not use the actual periods of enrollment for non-traditional programs, and they use their, let's say, published academic calendar rather than the actual periods of enrollment for which the student is enrolled based on the particular program. We also know that tracking breaks in attendance is often a challenge in non-traditional programs, and so it's important that you have internal control so that financial aid is notified when a student withdraws, when they go on LOA, when they're dismissed, etc. Step 5, establishing academic calendars. I'm going to talk a little bit about terminology here. We sometimes get confused when we're talking about a school's published calendar versus their academic calendar or the academic year that they would use for awarding financial aid. We often find that schools have a published calendar on their website and their catalog that does not correspond with the actual academic year or academic calendar that needs to be used for awarding financial aid. And sometimes that's the cause for the misstep when calculating the return of funds calculation or even enrollment reporting. So make sure that if you have a non-traditional program or you're beginning to start one, that you actually, when you're awarding financial aid, that you're actually using the academic year or calendar that you've established for that particular program. Not uncommon for schools to have multiple academic years because they have different programs with different academic years. And you need to pay attention to the different types of terms, standard, non-standard, or non-term. Standard terms. Standard terms typically correspond to a traditional calendar. Most of us are very familiar with these types of terms. All the classes begin and end within the established term dates. Some schools actually do bundle shorter terms or modules into a standard term. And in standard terms, progress is measured in credit hours. Non-standard terms. These are terms that are not semesters, trimesters, or quarters. They may be of equal or unequal length. In order to be considered substantially equal, no term can be more than 2 weeks different than any of the other terms, so it can't be more than 2 weeks longer than any other term. Otherwise, it's considered not substantially equal. And within non-standard terms, all classes do actually begin and end within the established term dates, and progress is measured in credit hours. Non-term. Non-term are terms, or actually periods of enrollment where progress is measured most often in clock hours. If it is measured in in credit hours, then the classes do not begin and end within a set time frame. Classes often overlap terms, and sequential classes do not begin and end within a term. So if your program doesn't meet the definition of standard or non-standard, then they're most likely going to be lumped into non-term. This is non-standard SE9W is a phrase or a term that you will see within CFR, the Code of Federal Regulations, or the Student Aid Handbook. It's important for you to pay attention to this because this does drive disbursements within payment periods. And it essentially refers to substantially equal 9-week term programs. Setting up payment periods and disbursement rules. Payment periods. It is in term-based programs, the payment period is the term. That's obvious. Or if the progress is based, if the student's academic progress is based on completion of hours and weeks, then the payment period will depend on the academic calendar you're using for the program and the fund being dispersed. This chart illustrates that in all categories except for non-standard term under the direct loan category, you will see that your payment period can be the term unless it is a non-standard term with not substantially equal terms. In that scenario, you need to wait until the student has completed at least 50% of the weeks and the credit hours or clock hours before making the second disbursement in your direct loans. Here are some payment period examples. So you see the standard term with modules. You'll see how there are 2 payment periods. This is a school that bundled 5-week mods into semesters. In the non-standard term, we have substantially equal non-week terms. You'll see that there are 4 payment periods, 1 each 9 weeks. And in the non-standard term, you'll see that you actually have 3 Pell payment periods, which you are allowed to do. But with direct loans, you're not allowed to do that, and you have to wait until 50% of the period or the term has been completed before you can make that second disbursement of direct loans. This chart outlines some disbursement limitations, and it provides you with some information at, again, when you can be making disbursements. This chart provides you with, again, some examples of potential dates or possible dates for making disbursements for a non-standard term with substantially equal 9-week terms. So you can review the dates of how the school established those dates based on the beginning and end date for each term. It is like with any other program, it's incredibly important that you check eligibility at disbursement. We know that when we're talking about non-traditional programs, checking eligibility at disbursement is more cumbersome. It requires more administrative capability because you're doing it more frequently. But it is critical because it's not uncommon to find students enrolled in these programs or for their enrollment to be more fluid, meaning that they may be coming in, stopping out, changing enrollment level. Step 7, creating budgets. You can follow the same rules for budget construction as for traditional programs. Some of the special considerations for non-traditional programs include cost of computer, especially if you're dealing with an online program, books and supplies. Sometimes books and supplies are included in the total price or the amount that you're being charged, that the student's being charged. The school is actually providing books. Travel and transportation will probably need to be different, again, depending upon the type of program you're offering. If it's on the ground, obviously you're still going to have that. If it's online, obviously you probably will want to minimize the allowances in those areas, if allow them at all. And room and board, it doesn't matter what type of program, the student still needs to pay for room and board. Step 8, developing packaging rules. If we're talking about dispersing Pell Grants, you need to make sure that you use Pell Grant Formula 3 if you're a non-standard term program. Non-term programs must use Pell Grant Formula 4, and you do need to consider crossover periods, which we'll review in a moment. Here's a Pell Grant Formula 3 example, and you'll see that if you look at the different bullets, you'll see that the student's enrollment level is different in term 4, where he's only enrolled in half time. So we actually outline the calculation here. So you see that the annual, you'll see the Pell Grant award for each term is essentially the same for terms 1, 2, and 3, but when that student drops down to half time in term 4, it has to be reduced. Crossover Pell payment periods. Many schools that use non-traditional programs utilize borrower-based academic years where you will have crossover periods. And a crossover period is when you have the student enrolls 2 different financial aid award years. And so you'll need to decide what award year you're going to attribute the Pell Grant and the direct loan to. This is something that it does take financial aid professionals take some time to get used to, but keep in mind that Pell Grants can be assigned to a different award year than all of the other students' financial aid. So it can get complicated. Again, this is a really good reason why you need to make sure you understand how you will apply this and that you have clear policies and procedures for how your institution will manage crossover periods in terms of both the awarding and disbursement of Pell and direct loans. Here's an example of a crossover Pell. And so you'll see that the student, come April term, is actually going to be awarded a Pell Grant for the 12-13 academic year or financial aid award year, even though that April term begins, before the 11-12 ends. And this school is able to do this because the April term would extend beyond July. So you'll see the April term runs from April 23rd to July 13th, and therefore the school is able to apply that Pell, the 12-13 Pell. Non-standard terms and direct loans. Most of us are clearly aware of what the scheduled academic year versus the borrower-based academic year is. We understand that, but the challenge is how do we apply that? The important thing to remember with this is that the borrower-based academic year floats with the student's attendance and progression, and it's not driven by a term start and end. This chart illustrates what formula you can use, when you can use a scheduled academic year versus when you would have to use one of the borrower-based academic year options. And you can see that if we're talking about a non-standard term or a non-term program, non-standard with terms that are not substantially equal, then you would have to use the borrower-based academic year 3. This slide can be helpful for you as a reference, reviewing the requirements of standard or non-standard terms with a traditional calendar of how you'd use a scheduled academic year. Again, scheduled academic year it has a specific beginning and ending date, and that the academic year definition must meet the requirement in terms of the number of weeks and hours. Here's a scheduled academic year example. And you'll see that in the first example, it's a semester-based program offered in 5-week modules, and the student is a second-year dependent student. So you can see how in the spring, where the student's enrolled in 12 credits, they would become eligible for sub and unsub, while in the first period, they're only enrolled in 3 credits, so they would not be eligible for that. In the second example, it's the same student, but the summer is treated as a trailer. And so you can see, because this is a traditional semester program, that the student's academic year, even under a scheduled academic year, becomes the spring and the summer. The important thing to remember here is that if you are a traditional semester-based program, your summer term and if you have an intersession term doesn't have to meet the definition for the minimum number of weeks, so 15 weeks or 30 credit hours, or 15 credit hours. It can be shorter because you are a traditional semester-based school. So this is one reason why you can use a scheduled academic year in this example. This chart outlines the borrow-based academic year 1. And again, it floats with the student's enrollment. And here's a borrow-based academic year 1 example. It's a standard term, 4-semester accelerated program that begins in the summer. It requires an associate degree for admission, and this is an example of an independent student. So you can see across the top bar the number of credits the students enrolled in each of the terms, and then you can see the distribution of financial aid for each one of those terms. The second example is a non-standard term. You have 4 9-week terms, September to May. Again, an independent student, sophomore. And again, you can see how the financial aid is distributed across the different terms. Borrow-based academic year 2. This is a standard or non-standard substantially equal term with non-traditional calendar. Again, it floats with the student's enrollment. And let's look at the example. So this is the example, non-standard term. Academic year is 4 9-week terms. The student is independent. First-year student begins in January. So you can see in this example we are dealing with a crossover period, the April to June, and you can see how the financial aid is distributed. Borrow-based academic year 3. Again, borrow-based academic year, it's floating with the student's enrollment. And you can use this chart as a reference. And let's look at the example. If this is a non-standard term program, the academic year is 4 8-week terms. We're going to assume 6 credits per term. This is a second-year independent student, and you can see how the aid is dispersed into 2 disbursements, and that the student must successfully complete the first payment period before the second payment period can be dispersed. So this actually is offering the least amount of flexibility or least amount of disbursements allowed for dispersing the direct loans. Overlapping loans, this is, again, something that is important for staff to understand and consider how your academic program is designed so that you make sure that if you are going to have overlapping loans, you understand whether you're going to be using scheduled academic year, borrow-based academic year 1 or 2, and how you're going to plot that out. Here's an example of overlapping loans, and you'll see it's a standard and non-standard term. And so you'll see in the first block there, the student attended a prior school, the annual award, This is how the student was awarded financial aid at that school. And so then they come and they start at your school, and this is where you would need to pay attention to what happened previously in that academic year. You can see the overlap is over the summer in April through June. At the old school and at the new school, it's April through July. And so the student has remaining eligibility that they can receive for that first term in that academic year. And then come July, they would kick into the new academic year. It is important that with non-traditional programs that you establish satisfactory academic progress standards. A mistake that schools make is of trying to simply apply their existing traditional SAP. There may be differences in your pace. There may be differences of warning. When you're going to put students on probation, there may be differences when you're going to be checking SAP. And in most cases, the new requirement of establishing academic plans will be different as well. So not uncommon for schools that have multiple non-traditional programs to actually have multiple satisfactory academic progress policies. So don't underestimate the importance of this. And you will need to pay attention to existing policies and procedures and standards, and will most likely need to modify them to meet the requirements of any of your non-traditional programs. Step 10, make sure you control for breaks in attendance. This is a very critical area that does get students in, get schools in trouble in the compliance area. Leave of absences, make sure that your leave of absence policy will actually work for non-traditional programs. Make sure that it meets the FSA or the FSA requirements in terms of not longer than 180 days and that it has a clear start and end date. If it doesn't meet those criteria, then you're going to want to modify it, because if a student does take a term off and they're not put on LOA, then you will have issues with enrollment reporting. You could have issues with return of funds calculations, et cetera, et cetera. What's the definition of withdrawn? Programs measured in credit hours. It's clear the student doesn't complete all the days in the payment period or the period of enrollment the student was scheduled to complete. Obvious, most of us are familiar with that. If the program is offered in modules, that's if the student ceases attendance at any point prior to completing the payment period or the period of enrollment, unless the school obtains written confirmation that the student will attend a module that begins later in the same payment period or period of enrollment. So this does get a little tricky. This gets back to actually monitoring enrollment. And so you can see how the time frame for tracking whether students are seated in class or not is much more compressed in any type of module or non-standard term or non-term program. So it's critical that you have the mechanisms in place to track those changes. Unfortunately, those of us in financial aid know all too well that the feed to track that needs to be coming from probably the academic side, might even rest with faculty seated or faculty teaching in these programs to whomever they report to on the academic side, that then needs to get filtered to the registrar, and then that needs to get forwarded on to the financial aid office. We also know that R2T4, again, is incredible or an important area to pay attention to that has substantial risk if attendance or enrollment is not tracked adequately. And we also know that when you're performing the R2T4 calculation for students in your non-traditional programs, that you really need to be counting the days and the periods of within the periods of enrollment that you're using for those programs, and not, again, as I indicated earlier, your published academic calendar. And finally, step 11, don't forget to deliver your consumer information. Sometimes we overlook how we're disseminating the required information to students in these programs. You're still obligated to provide all the same kind of information to students in all of your programs, and so sometimes the delivery methodology needs to be altered to make sure that you're getting it in front of them. And it includes typical things like gainful employment disclosures, FERPA authorizations, entrance counseling, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I hope that you've found this webinar to be informational and helpful to you. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us, and we will be happy to respond to any questions you have about your particular situation, or maybe a future direction that you're thinking of taking in terms of introducing non-traditional financial aid for your non-traditional programs. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Phil, for hosting the webinar today, and we really appreciate all your insight and information. We hope that everyone will be able to join us at our next webinar that will be presented by Dr. David Kleinfelter, the Chief Academic Officer at Learning House. It will be on optimal organization and governance of online programs. It's Thursday, October 18th at 2 o'clock Eastern Time. Thank you again for attending.